I want you to try and picture a specific road with me today. Uh, Obviously, don't close your eyes if you're driving or anything, but if you can, just try to visualize this. We are in the first century. The sun is just beating down on the Galilean hills. It is that really dry, relentless heat that just bakes the earth. And we are standing right outside a small town called Nain.
Right, and we should clarify that Nain is not a necropolis by any stretch. It is a village.
Yep.
It's the kind of place where everybody knows exactly what you had for dinner last night, and they definitely know the names of your children.
Yeah,
It's a
exactly.
place where privacy just doesn't really exist. In those small Galilean communities, your business is the town's business. And when grief strikes, your grief becomes the town's grief.
So picture this really dusty, narrow road leading right out of the city gate. And on this particular day, it is just choked with people, but it's not a normal traffic jam. It is an actual collision.
Yeah.
You have two massive crowds moving in opposite directions, and they are destined to crash into each other right there at the gate.
It really is a collision of two entirely different realities. It is almost cinematic in how Luke sets this up in the gospel. On one side, leaving the town, you have this procession of loss. It's a funeral. And in that culture, this is not a quiet, somber affair with hushed whispers in the back of a church.
No, it's loud.
Very loud. There is public wailing. There are flutes playing these jarring, mournful tunes. It is literally the sound of death marching toward a graveyard.
And then coming up the road, heading into the town, is this procession of life. You have Jesus, his disciples, and this massive crowd of followers who are just hanging on his every word. They are probably excited, maybe chatting about the teachings they have just heard. And suddenly, these two currents, the current of life and the current of death, they meet face to face.
And caught right in the middle, right at the impact point of these two crowds, is one woman. The source material for our deep dive today focuses incredibly intensely on her. She is known simply as the widow of Nain. We're going to be walking through a really profound essay by Brother Woody Brome titled The Widow of Nain, A Life Restored by Jesus' Compassion. And I have to say, looking at this analysis, this was not just a tragic day for this woman. This was the absolute dismantling of her entire existence.
Let's really get into that because I think we read the word widow in the Bible and we just think, okay, she's sad because her husband died, and of course that is true. But the essay argues there is so much more at stake here. This woman is walking behind the bier of her only son.
Her only son. That is the specific detail that changes the entire landscape of this story. The author points out that grief had already visited this woman's house before. She had already stood by a grave and buried her husband.
Right.
That was the first tragedy. But now, the text explicitly tells us this young man on the stretcher was her only son.
So she has literally no other children to comfort her, no other family to lean on at all.
It is so much worse than just lacking emotional comfort. This son was the one who carried her family name. He was the one who guarded her future. In a very literal, practical sense, he was her retirement plan, her Social Security, and her legal protection all rolled into one person. And now he lies still.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really walk through this essay just step by step. We want to understand the heart of Jesus when he is confronted with this kind of absolute hopeless death. We want to look at the theological significance because there is some incredibly deep theology happening here regarding who Jesus actually is. And we want to find the practical comfort for you, the listener, in your life today.
And just a quick note on the tone here. This essay is serious, it's warm, it's very pastoral, and it treats Luke chapter 7 with a profound amount of reverence. This is not just a cool story about a supernatural magic trick. It is a genuine revelation of God's character. So we really want to treat it with that exact same weight today.
Yeah, it really is a window into the very heart of God. It shows us exactly how he reacts when he sees us hurting.
Exactly.
But before we get to the miracle itself, I want to spend some time on the historical and cultural setting. We mentioned Nain is on the slopes of the Galilean hills. I feel like when I read the Gospels, the geography often just blurs into, well, Jesus went to a town. Does it actually matter that it was Nain?
It matters immensely. And I love to get into the biblical geography because it almost always unlocks a layer of the story we completely miss otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Nain is situated on the northwestern slope of the Hill of Moher. Now, that might not mean much to a modern reader, but if you look at a map of Old Testament history, the Hill of Moher is right across the valley from a place called Shunem.
Shunem. Wait, that sounds really familiar. That is an Old Testament location, right?
Yeah, it is. Shunem is the territory of the prophet Elisha. In 2 Kings chapter 4, Elisha raises a Shunammite woman's son from the dead. So Jesus is not just wandering aimlessly around the countryside. He is purposefully walking into a region that is historically saturated with the memory of a great prophet raising the dead. By walking into Nain, he's stepping right into the shadow of Elisha. The people there knew their history. They knew that God had acted there before.
So the stage is essentially set for a comparison.
Absolutely. The geography itself dares the people in that crowd to ask, is this man like Elisha? Or is he something entirely more?
Then, as we said earlier, this is a really small town. The essay emphasizes this small town dynamic. I grew up in a decent-sized city, so I can be completely anonymous if I want to be. But in Nain, everyone knew everyone.
There is zero anonymity in a village of that size. When a tragedy strikes, it belongs for the whole community. Everyone knew the names associated with every sorrow. When this funeral procession came out of the gate, the people in the crowd were not turning to each other asking who died. They already knew. They knew it was her son. They knew the painful history of that household. They probably vividly remembered the day of that first funeral when she buried her husband.
That adds such a heavy layer of shared grief to the whole scene. It is not just an anonymous body passing by, it is a neighbor. But let's go back to the widow's specific situation. You touched on this earlier, but I want to drill down much deeper into it. The essay states that in the first century, for a widow, the situation went far beyond emotional sadness. The author uses the word insecurity.
Insecurity is honestly a polite way of saying total destitution. We have to really work to strip away our modern context here. Today, if a woman loses her husband and her son, it is an unimaginable emotional tragedy, of course. But she likely has access to life insurance, a job, a bank account in her own name, or some form of government assistance. In first-century Judea, a woman's status was almost entirely derivative of the men in her life.
So without a husband or a grown son, she essentially has no standing.
She has virtually no legal personhood in the public sphere. She could not inherit property in the same way a man could. She could not prosecute a court case easily. Her economic future, her basic ability to just buy daily bread, was tied directly to her husband. When he died, that entire heavy responsibility passed to her son. This young man on the bier was not just her beloved child, he was her absolute lifeline. With him gone, she is staring down a future of begging. She is looking at potentially having to sell herself into servitude just to survive.
That is genuinely terrifying. It is not just grief she's feeling, it is raw terror.
It is absolute terror. She is facing the extinction of her family line and a threat to her own physical survival. And this is exactly why the Bible speaks so forcefully and so frequently about widows. You really can't read the Old Testament without realizing that God has a special, fiercely protective fury when it comes to widows.
The essay actually lists a few of those references. Exodus 22 seems pretty intense.
Exodus 22, verses 22 and 23. The Lord plainly says, "Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless." And listen to the specific promise attached to it. He says, "If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword."
Wow. God is not subtle about that at all.
Well, not at all. He takes their protection incredibly personally. Deuteronomy 10.1 describes God as the one who defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow. Psalm 68.5 calls God a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows. So when Luke, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, focuses his narrative lens on this specific woman at the gate of Nain, it is not an accident. It is not just adding a sad detail to the story.
It is a theological setup.
It is a massive setup to show that God keeps his ancient promises. We are about to see Jesus doing exactly what God said he would do back in Exodus. He is acting as the direct defender of the defenseless.
Now, I want to try to put you, the listener, right in the sandals of someone standing in that crowd. We really need to understand the atmosphere of this moment. The essay discusses the funerary customs of the time. You mentioned earlier that it was loud.
Extremely loud.
Yeah.
In Jewish custom at the time, even the absolute poorest family was expected to hire at least 2 flute players and 1 professional wailing woman for a funeral. And given that this was the only son of a widow, the whole town would have turned out in solidarity. So you have the shrill, piercing sound of flutes, the rhythmic, agonizing wailing, and the physical tearing of clothes. It is a complete sensory overload of grief.
And these things moved incredibly fast, right?
Very fast. In the hot climate of the Middle East, decomposition starts almost immediately. There was no embalming process like we have in the West today. Burial usually happened the exact same day as the death, often before sundown. So the shock for this mother is completely fresh. This boy might have been perfectly fine at breakfast and dead by mid-afternoon.
And the body is not hidden away in a sealed mahogany casket either.
No, not at all. It is carried on a bier, which is essentially just an open stretcher or wooden plank. The body would be wrapped in a burial shroud, but the human form of the body is entirely visible. The reality of death is right out there in the open.
This brings us to a major point in the essay regarding the taboo of death, the purity laws.
This is so critical for understanding everything that happens next. We have to go back to Numbers chapter 19. Under the Mosaic law, a dead human body is the ultimate source of ritual uncleanness. In Jewish tradition, it is known as the father of fathers of uncleanness.
That sounds intense. What did that actually mean for them practically?
It meant that if you touched a dead body, or even just touched the bier carrying it, you became ritually unclean for 7 full days. You could not go to the temple. You could not participate in the festivals. You could not offer sacrifices. You were effectively cut off from the entire worship life and social life of the community. And to get clean again, you had to go through a very complex ritual involving water mixed with the ashes of a red heifer.
So it was not just a matter of, oh, go wash your hands and you're good. It was a week-long ordeal.
It was a logistical nightmare and a genuine spiritual crisis. So the natural human reaction, the pious, law-abiding Jewish reaction, is to physically recoil. When you see a funeral procession coming your way on a narrow road, you press yourself flat against the stone wall. You give it a very wide berth. You do not want that shadow passing over you. You want to stay clean.
So imagine the tension of this scene. Jesus and his large crowd are approaching the gate. The funeral is coming out. The natural physics of the situation dictates that Jesus's crowd should just part like the Red Sea to let the march of death go through. They should all be backing away.
That is exactly what everyone expected. That is what cultural custom demanded. That is what the law of Moses implied. Step back. Do not get contaminated.
But the people of Nain, as you mentioned, had that prophetic precedent. They knew the stories of Elijah and Elisha.
They did, and this is such important context to keep in mind. They knew that prophets could raise the dead because it had literally happened in their own backyard centuries ago. But, and this is a huge distinction, look at how Elijah and Elisha actually did it.
How is their method different from what Jesus is about to do?
It was a massive struggle for them. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah stretches himself out on the dead boy's body 3 different times. He cries out to the Lord. He says, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." He is pleading. He is asking God to do something incredibly difficult. Same thing with Elisha. He paces back and forth in the room. He lays on the body, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes. It is an exhausting labor of prayer.
So in their theology, resurrection was definitely possible, but it required a massive wrestling match with God to get it done.
Correct. It was not something a prophet just commanded on his own authority. It was a miracle you begged God for. These cultural memories set the stage for the crowd's reaction to Jesus, but as we are about to see in the text, Jesus operates on a completely different frequency of authority.
Let's actually walk right through the biblical narrative now. We are looking at Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 13. The text starts with the phrase "soon afterward," placing us right in the continuous flow of his earthly ministry. But then we get the encounter. Verse 13 says, "When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her."
That is the pivot point of the universe right there. When the Lord saw her, he didn't just see a noisy crowd. He didn't just see a generic funeral. He saw her. He isolated the specific agonizing pain of this one individual woman.
And that phrase, "his heart went out to her," the essay makes a really big deal about this language. Is it just saying he felt bad for her? Like a passing thought of, oh, that is really a shame.
No, and this is where the English translation really fails to capture the weight of it. The original Greek word used here is splunchnisomai. It is a mouthful, but it is incredibly powerful. It relates directly to the splanchna, which are the internal organs, the guts, the bowels.
So it is essentially a gut punch.
Exactly. It describes a visceral, deep physical reaction. It is that sudden feeling you get in the very pit of your stomach when you witness something truly horrific or heartbreaking. It's not a polite, distant, sentimental pity. It is a violent wrenching of the insides. Jesus looked at this destitute widow, and the total devastation of her life literally hit him in the gut.
That is so profound, because I think we often picture God as stoic or distant or just unshakable. But this text suggests God is deeply, viscerally emotional when he sees our pain.
He absolutely is. And notice the sequence of events here. This is crucial for our understanding. Jesus did not wait for a request.
You know, I hadn't really thought about that before reading this, but you are totally right. In almost every other miracle story we read, someone is actively asking for it. Blind Bartimaeus is screaming, "Son of David, have mercy on me." The lepers are shouting from a distance. Jairus comes and physically falls down at Jesus' feet.
Even the centurion sent his friends to ask on his behalf.
Yeah.
But here, the widow is completely silent. She is too consumed by her grief to even notice Jesus is there. She isn't looking around for a miracle worker. She is just staring at a grave. She has absolutely no hope left to even form a prayer. And yet, Jesus acts. As the author beautifully writes, the Lord's pity moves toward pain without being summoned.
Without being summoned, that is such a profound comfort for anyone listening to this deep dive who feels too exhausted or too broken to even pray.
It really is. It shows us that his compassion is not a wage we have to earn by having enough faith or by saying the exact right prayer. It flows entirely from who he is. He sees the desperate need, and his very nature compels him to move toward it.
So, feeling this gut-wrenching compassion, he finally speaks to her. And what he says is honestly quite strange. He says to this sobbing, broken mother, "Don't cry."
Now, we need to pause right there. If I walked up to a grieving mother at a funeral who just lost her only child, and I looked at her and said, "Don't cry," I would rightly be considered the most insensitive person on the planet.
Right. It sounds totally dismissive, like, hey, buck up, get over it, stop making a scene.
Because usually when we tell someone don't cry, it is because we are uncomfortable with their pain. We want them to stop weeping so that we can feel better. But coming from the lips of Jesus, the essay argues this is absolutely not a dismissal of her grief. It is actually a promise wrapped in a command.
A promise wrapped in a command. Break that down for us. What does that mean?
It means he has the inherent authority to completely remove the root cause of the tears. He isn't saying suppress your valid emotion. He is saying you are about to have no reason to weep anymore. He speaks the profound comfort before he even performs the miracle. He is asking her to trust his word just for a moment before she actually sees his work.
And then comes the action, the miracle itself. This is Luke 7, verse 14. It says, "Then he went up and touched the bier."
The touch. This is where we have to recall those purity laws we talked about in Numbers 19. The moment Jesus steps forward and reaches out his hand, the crowd probably audibly gasped. You just do not do that. You do not touch the open coffin of a dead man.
And the text notes that the bearers stood still.
They froze in their tracks. I imagine they were utterly stunned. Who is this rabbi openly violating the strict law of Moses? Who is this man willingly making himself ceremonially unclean in front of the whole town? But this is exactly where the theology gets incredible. The essay explains that by placing his hand on that wooden bier, Jesus isn't just carelessly disregarding the law. He is fulfilling it in a way no one there could have ever expected.
How does he fulfill it? By touching it?
Well, in the Old Testament religious system, uncleanness was highly contagious. If I touch a leper, I do not make the leper well. The leper makes me sick. If I touch the dead, I do not bring them to life. I simply become unclean myself. The flow of power is always from death to life, from dirty to clean. It corrupts. But Jesus completely reverses the flow.
He reverses the flow.
Yes. When Jesus touches the bier, he does not catch death. Death catches life. His inherent holiness is infinitely more powerful than the corruption of the grave. He transmits abundant life right into the situation. He proves that he is the source of a holiness that actively conquers defilement, rather than having to shrink away from it in fear.
So he voluntarily absorbs the cost, but he completely overrides the consequence.
Beautifully put. He overrides the consequence. And having established that shocking physical connection, he then speaks directly to the body.
He says, "Young man, I say to you, get up."
And again, compare this to Elijah. Elijah prayed intensely to God. Jesus speaks directly as God. He uses this incredibly emphatic phrase, "I say to you." It is inherent, divine authority. He doesn't need to check in with headquarters first. He is headquarters.
And he speaks to a corpse as if the guy is just taking a heavy nap. "Young man, get up." It is so casual.
It is the absolute calmness of total power. He doesn't scream at the sky. He doesn't chant. He doesn't need any special incantations. He just commands. He treats death like an unwanted intruder that simply has to leave because the rightful homeowners arrived on the scene.
And the result is immediate.
Immediate. Verse 15 says, "The dead man sat up and began to talk."
I really love that specific detail. He began to talk.
It is the absolute proof of life. It proves to everyone watching that this was not a parlor trick or a trick of the light. It wasn't some zombie reanimation where he is groggy or staring blankly. All the faculties of human life, the mind, the voice, the breath, they all returned it instantly. We don't know what he said. Maybe he asked, "Mom, why are we outside?" Or maybe he just said, "I'm hungry." But the sheer fact that he spoke meant he was fully, completely back.
And then Luke adds this really beautiful, tender little phrase at the end of the verse. It says, "And Jesus gave him back to his mother."
That specific phrase is a direct word-for-word echo of 1 Kings 17, where Elijah gives the revived boy back to his mother. Luke is intentionally making the theological connection for his readers. But the emotional resonance of that moment is what the essay really focuses on. The author called it folding a broken household into the kindness of God.
Folding a broken household into the kindness of God. That is a lovely image.
Think about the restraint there. Jesus could have easily said, "Okay, kid, I just saved your life. Now you work for me. Come follow me on the road." He could have rightfully claimed him as a disciple right then and there. But he didn't. He recognized the vital human relationship. He saw the desperate practical need of that widow. He restored the fragile family unit. He gave him back to the one person who needed him the absolute most. It shows us that Jesus deeply values our human relationships and validates that powerful bond between a mother and her son.
So the boy is talking. The mother is probably just in an absolute state of shock and overwhelming joy. What about the massive crowd standing around them? The essay describes a major emotional shift.
A seismic cultural shift. They went from professional wailing to a spontaneous chorus of praise. The text says fear seized them all. And that is not terror. That is that holy trembling awe you feel when the veil between heaven and earth gets incredibly thin. And they instantly concluded two things. First, they shouted, "A great prophet has appeared among us."
That is them making the Elijah connection, right?
Exactly. They recognize the historical pattern. But then they go even further than that. They say, God has come to help his people.
God has come to help his people.
That single sentence, the essay argues, is the true heartbeat of the entire story. It connects all the way back to the very beginning of our discussion. The God of Exodus, the God who fiercely defends the widow, has physically arrived. It is divine visitation. And there is a really important contextual link here in Luke's gospel that we shouldn't miss.
What is that link?
Just a little later in this same chapter, Luke 7, John the Baptist is sitting in a prison cell. He is discouraged, he is facing execution, and he sends his messengers to Jesus asking a very honest question. He asks, "Are you really the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?"
So even John the Baptist had his doubts.
Everyone struggles with doubt when they are in the dark. And Jesus sends back a specific report to John. He doesn't just give him a dry theological treatise. He says, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, and the dead are raised."
He is pointing directly back to Nain.
He is using this exact event as Exhibit A for his identity. This miracle wasn't done in secret in a back room. It was massive public proof, designed to answer the deepest doubts of the faithful.
Let's transition into the theological significance section of our deep dive. The essay breaks this down into a few key areas, and I really want to take our time walking through each one because this is where the rubber really meets the road for us. The first major heading here is the identity of Jesus.
This story inherently forces every single listener to answer one massive question. Who is this man? And the definitive answer provided by the text is this. He is the Lord who sees, who feels, and who acts.
We talked heavily about how his heart went out to her.
Yes, and the author emphasizes that this is not just fleeting sentiment. It is a profound revelation of willing love. Jesus doesn't just project raw power coldly from a distance. He pours his infinite power directly through the channel of human compassion. He perfectly fulfills the Old Testament picture of God actively visiting his people. In Psalm 33, verse 6, we read that God simply speaks the entire world into being. Here at Nain, that exact same creative, divine voice speaks life back into a dead boy's lungs. It is an undeniable assertion of his deity.
Now, the essay brings up a theological term that might be new to some of our listeners, or maybe even a bit debated depending on your background. It discusses the dispensational view, or the kingdom view. Can we unpack that carefully? Why does the author include this specific framework?
It is really important for understanding the timing, the why now of this specific miracle. A dispensational view generally emphasizes that God has distinct administrations or economies for how he deals with humanity throughout history. Specifically, it distinguishes between his promises and plan for the nation of Israel and his plan for the church.
Okay, so how does the miracle at Nain fit into that framework?
Well, during his earthly ministry, Jesus came presenting himself primarily as the promised Messiah, the rightful king of Israel. The Old Testament prophets explicitly predicted that when the Messiah finally came, he would bring a kingdom characterized by total physical restoration. Isaiah 35 says, "The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the ransom of the Lord will return."
So raising the dead was basically part of presenting his messianic credentials to the nation.
Exactly. It was a tangible sign directly to the nation of Israel. It was Jesus declaring, "The kingdom is here in my person. I am the king who has the power to reverse the ancient curse of death." It was a bona fide, legitimate offer of the kingdom to Israel.
But looking at history, we know that Israel as a nation largely rejected him.
Right. They tragically rejected their king, and so the establishment of that physical kingdom on earth was postponed. We are now living in what theologians often call the church age. But the author's key point here is that even though we aren't living in that future millennial kingdom yet, where death is fully and permanently abolished, this miracle at Nain still serves as a vital preview for us.
A preview, like a movie trailer for the coming kingdom.
That is a perfect analogy. It shows us the unchanging nature of the king, and that strengthens the church today. We live in this tension of the already and the not yet. The kingdom is here in part through the Spirit, but not yet in its physical fullness. But this story reminds every believer that the Lord we serve today still has the exact same power. As Romans 11 reminds us, God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. The sovereign power he demonstrated to Israel is the exact same power he holds and wields for his church today.
So it is not just an interesting history lesson. It is a rock-solid future promise.
Correct. It validates the Savior we worship on Sunday is not just a good moral teacher who lived a long time ago. He is the eternal Lord of life.
Speaking of him being the Lord of life, the essay also highlights his authority over death. It mentions a trio of raisings in the gospel accounts.
This is a really fascinating biblical pattern to trace. There are 3 specific, detailed accounts of Jesus raising the dead in the Gospels. The widow's son here at Nain, Jairus' daughter in Mark chapter 5, and his friend Lazarus in John chapter 11.
Is there a deliberate progression in those 3 stories?
Many scholars definitely see one. Think about the timeline. Jairus' daughter had just died. She was still lying in her own bed. The widow's son was actively on the way to the grave, so he had been dead for maybe a few hours. Lazarus had been sealed in a tomb for 4 full days, and Martha explicitly warns that decomposition and the odor of death had already set in.
So it systematically shows his absolute authority over every single stage of death.
Precisely. Fresh death, processed death, and decaying death. It absolutely does not matter to him. Death obeys his voice immediately and totally in every single case. There is never a struggle.
But as the essay points out, there is a cost. We talked about the physical touch earlier, but the author draws a much deeper theological line here under the heading, the cost of the touch.
This is really the heart of the Christian gospel in a nutshell. We mentioned that by intentionally touching the bier, Jesus technically became ceremonially unclean according to the Mosaic law. He willingly took that ritual pollution onto himself.
He voluntarily dirtied himself, socially and religiously speaking.
And the theological implication of that action is just massive. It directly foreshadows the cross. The author writes this beautiful line. He says, "He will touch the cross to bear sins so death loses its legal claim." By touching the bier at Nain, Jesus is acting out in miniature what he is going to do on a cosmic scale at Calvary. He takes our sin, our death, our uncleanness squarely upon his own shoulders.
It reminds me of 2 Corinthians. He who knew no sin became sin for us.
2 Corinthians 5.21, exactly. He willingly takes the defilement so that we can freely have the life. The miracle at Nain is essentially a vivid, visual sermon on substitutionary atonement. He trades places with us. He boldly walks into our sphere of death so that we can safely walk into his sphere of eternal life.
That is just beautiful. It changes the whole story from being just a random miracle to being a perfect picture of the gospel itself.
It rightfully puts the cross right in the dead center of the narrative.
There is one more major theological distinction the essay makes in this section. It contrasts the temporary versus the eternal.
Yes, and we have to be intellectually honest and realistic here. This young man at Nain, he is not still walking around the shores of Galilee today. He eventually died again.
Which means he had to go through the whole process of dying and having a funeral twice. That is really rough to think about.
It is. Theologically speaking, this was not a resurrection in the final, ultimate sense, what we would call receiving a glorified body that can never die again. It was a miraculous resuscitation back to mortal life. He was brought back to the exact same broken world of taxes, getting sick, growing old, and eventually dying.
So what is the actual point of the miracle if the guy is just going to die again later?
The point is that the event is a sign. The author points out that this temporary miracle points forward to the morning that will never end. It is a divine signpost. 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of the final great resurrection, when the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable. Nain is essentially a down payment. It says if Jesus can so easily do this for a mortal body right now, just imagine what he will do when he calls all of us from the grave at the end of human history.
It points directly to the ultimate permanent defeat of death.
Right. It is not the final victory itself, but it undeniably proves that the victor has arrived.
Let's pivot now to the final major section of the essay, the spiritual lessons and application. The author gives us 5 specific takeaways here. I'm going to go through each of these carefully because they answer the big question. So what? What do I actually do with this information on a random Tuesday morning?
Let's do it. We need that practical grounding.
Lesson 1 is focused on the heart of Jesus.
This one is specifically for the listener who constantly feels invisible or forgotten. The essay notes that Jesus actively notices the overlooked people in society. The noisy crowd just saw a funeral procession, but Jesus saw a grieving mother. He saw the hurting individual lost in the middle of the mass.
That is such a huge encouragement. Sometimes in our modern culture, everything is so big and fast, we just feel like a number. Or worse, we feel like our personal grief is just too small or too messy for God to care about.
The author says this so warmly. He says, if you ever wonder if your private tears matter, remember that he has not changed. Psalm 34.18 assures us that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He's not too busy running the distant galaxies to stop and notice a single weeping widow in a dusty little town. He constantly invites the weary to come and rest. If you are deeply hurting today, you are exactly the kind of person Jesus is actively looking for.
That is powerful. Lesson 2 is called What Love Does. And this one is really about our own action.
Right. Compassion, in the biblical sense, is not just a fleeting mood. It is a demanding way of life. It is an active verb. Jesus fulfilled the highest law of love by reaching out and touching the unclean. He crossed a massive social and religious barrier to bring help. The essay connects this directly to James chapter 1, verse 27, which gives us the biblical definition of pure religion.
You know, religion is kind of a dirty word for a lot of people these days. It has a lot of baggage. But how does James actually define it?
It is fascinating. James says pure and faultless religion is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Notice the priority there. It is not about how high you can jump during worship music or how flawlessly you can argue systematic theology. It is fundamentally about practical care for the vulnerable.
And the author brings a pretty strong challenge to the modern church here, doesn't he?
He really does. He states plainly that spiritual maturity is measured by actual care, not by making a lot of noise. It is about what the early church called the ministry of tables. Back in Acts chapter 6, the apostles appointed deacons for the specific practical purpose of making sure the widows were getting enough food every day. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, the apostle Paul spends a significant amount of time giving detailed instructions on exactly how the local church should financially and socially support widows.
So the direct application for us is to ask, who is the widow in your specific life right now?
Exactly. Who is vulnerable in your circle? Who is truly alone? It might be literal widows sitting in the pews of your congregation, but it might also be the overwhelmed single mom living down the street from you. It might be the elderly neighbor whose kids never bother to call or visit. The hard lesson here is this: if we actually claim to follow the Jesus of Nain, we must become the hands that carry the heavy groceries, that help pay the utility bills, and that sit quietly in the sterile hospital waiting rooms. We have to be willing to touch the biers of our own culture.
That is incredibly convicting.
Yeah.
Because it is so easy to just feel a quick pang of compassion, but it is so much harder to actually write the check or make the time to visit.
It is much harder. But that is the unavoidable call of Christ on our lives.
Lesson 3 shifts our focus a bit. It is titled Hope Stronger Than Graves.
This brings us right back to the bedrock hope of the final resurrection. Nain is a divine pledge that the last funeral will eventually be interrupted. I just love how the author phrases that. The last funeral will be interrupted. Jesus promises in John chapter 5 that a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out.
So because of that promise, Christian grief is fundamentally different from worldly grief.
It is entirely different.
Yeah.
Now, we still cry. Jesus himself wept openly at Lazarus' tomb, so tears are never a sign of weak faith. But as Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we do not grieve as those who have no hope. We have an eternal until. We say goodbye for now. We do not say goodbye forever. Our ultimate comfort is anchored in the historical fact that Jesus himself conquered the grave on Easter morning. He isn't asking us to just trust a comforting philosophy. He's asking us to trust his proven victory over death.
That is such a comforting perspective. Now, lesson 4 is really interesting. It is about faith's timing. This goes back to the detail that the widow never actually asked for the miracle.
This is a massive sigh of relief. for the control freaks among us, and I definitely include myself in that category. Sometimes in our Christian walk, we mistakenly feel like everything absolutely depends on our own performance. We ask ourselves, did I pray the exact right words? Did I muster up enough internal faith? Did I bind the right spiritual forces?
Yeah, we often treat prayer like it's a magic spell, like if we get one syllable wrong, the whole thing just doesn't work.
Exactly. We put all the burden on ourselves. But right here in Luke, Jesus acted completely freely. Romans 9:15 reminds us that God says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. This grieving widow did absolutely nothing but stand there and cry, and Jesus acted to save her.
But doesn't that raise a question? Does that mean we shouldn't bother praying if he's just going to do what he wants anyway?
Not at all. The author argues powerfully that this truth actually makes our prayer life bold, not non-existent. We trust him because he fundamentally cares, not because we can manipulate or control him with our words. We can bring our deepest, messiest sorrows to him with total confidence, knowing that he is inherently good. And this is admittedly the hard part. When his answer is not yet, or when the physical healing doesn't come on this side of heaven, we have to trust his sovereign wisdom. We have to trust that he clearly sees the end from the beginning. We trust that his apparent delay is never, ever evidence of his indifference.
That is a really hard lesson to walk through in the valleys of life, but a deeply necessary one. Finally, we have lesson 5, which is called keeping the storyline straight.
This circles back to the dispensational framework we discussed earlier. As readers of Scripture, we need to recognize the unique historical place of Israel. These massive public signs demonstrated clearly that Jesus was their promised king. But we also need to recognize our current everyday reality. We are walking on what the author calls the wide road of Christian life, where Christ indwells believers today by his Holy Spirit.
It makes me think of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10.
Right. We are saved entirely by grace through faith, and we are taught to love others exactly as we have been loved by God. The raw, visceral compassion that Jesus showed at the gate of Nain is the exact same compassion he now pours into our own hearts by the Holy Spirit. He doesn't just do miracles for us. He does his restorative work through us. As the church, we are called to literally become the active agents of his compassion in a hurting world today.
It is such a beautiful narrative journey. We started this deep dive walking on a road of mourning, just dusty and loud with absolute despair, and we end up walking on a road of joyful praise.
From a dark grave to abundant life. From a devastating funeral to a town-wide festival.
And I really love the final point the author makes in the outro about the dual obedience in this story.
Yes, that is a brilliant observation. If you look closely, there were two distinct commands issued by Jesus. To the grieving mother, he said, don't cry. That command required the obedience of faith and trust. She had to actively stop her wailing and start watching him. And to the dead son, he said, get up. That required the obedience of nature itself, receiving breath back into dead lungs. Both the living and the dead had to respond to the authoritative voice of Jesus.
And the essay leaves us with this final, beautiful encouragement. Jesus does not stand far away from our graves. He stands right beside them with us.
He binds up the brokenhearted. Nain allows us to, as the author says, hear the future in advance. It is an unbreakable promise that one day God will personally wipe away every single tear from our eyes.
I think the absolute best way to close out this deep dive is to just return to the text itself. We have analyzed it, we have pulled it apart and looked at the history, but let's just let the Word of God speak for itself as we end.
Let's hear it. This is Luke chapter 7, verses 13 to 15.
When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her and he said, don't cry. Then he went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, young man, I say to you, get up. The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother.
Amen to that.
And now, as we wrap up our time together, we just want to offer a short, simple blessing for you, the listener, based squarely on this amazing text.
May you truly know the Lord who sees your hidden tears, who touches your broken life with his tender mercy, and who has the absolute power to restore your hope, even when you are walking in the very shadow of death. Trust his good heart today.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We will see you next time.